everybody. Thank you for being here today. We are very happy to welcome the General Counsel of Ireland, Ciara DE MORA, and also Dr. Avila KILMURRAY, who is, I leave the Council introduce Avila KILMURRAY. President Carpano asked me to deputize for him on account of his busy schedule. So welcome once again. It is my great pleasure to host this conference today about the commemoration of the Good Friday Agreement. And you know that our university is currently celebrating its 50th anniversary. That is to say, it was created in 1973. And on the occasion of the 50th anniversary, the university is hosting a number of conferences entitled The Great Witnesses. And the general idea is to look both backward and forward on this occasion, and to invite people who have had an important public role and who have, because of their actions or because of what they wrote, contributed to change the course of history for the better, actually. So 1973 is also the year when the Sunningdale Agreement was signed, and we can consider that the Sunningdale Agreement is the very, very early stage of the peace process concerning Northern Ireland. And the peace process will end with, or nearly end, with the Good Friday Agreement, only after 30 years of conflict that took many lives on both sides. So in the current context of heightened international tensions, I think it does make sense to celebrate the Good Friday Agreement and to try and think of how its achievements can be protected and secured by younger generations. And this is precisely what we are going to talk about today with Dr. Avila KILMURRAY and the General Counsel of Ireland. And we'll start by showing you a short video before an introduction of Dr. Avila KILMURRAY by the General Counsel of Ireland. Thank you very much.
My name is Ciara DE MORA. I'm the Consul General of Ireland here in Lyon. We opened the consulate a little bit over a year ago as part of an expansion of our diplomatic network. And this year, we were asked to celebrate a number of key anniversaries for Ireland. Is this not turned on? Okay. Sorry, I'm too tall. I could crouch. Too tall. Okay, we'll adjust this again later. Sorry, I'll start again. My name's Ciara DE MORA. I'm the Consul General of Ireland. We opened a year ago, and this year we're celebrating a few key milestones for Ireland. The first one is that 100 years ago, as a very young state, we joined the League of Nations as one of our first actions, and it shows a commitment to multilateralism, which is a theme which will come through again as we talk about efforts to build peace in Northern Ireland and the importance that international support had for that peace building. The second anniversary that we were asked to celebrate this year is 50 years of membership of the European Union, another key actor in peace building in Northern Ireland. And I'll let Dr. KILMURRAY speak a little bit more maybe during her presentation around EU peace funds and international support as it was brought in to peace building. The last anniversary, maybe I should actually open a little parenthesis here before getting to the last anniversary, which is important to us this year. Not an Irish anniversary, but an anniversary which is important and which we will be marking in December, is the 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that idea of taking a human rights perspective, taking a gendered perspective, of inclusiveness in peace negotiations is what the little extract from the film is all about. If you want to see the film, come along this evening. We're showing it at the Goethe Institute. You have a QR code, you can sign up there if you haven't already signed up. So now I'll get on to the main point of being here today, and that is to celebrate the 25th anniversary of probably one of the more successful peace agreements that the world has seen. And as you were saying earlier, Professor Jobert, it is important, I think, in these times to talk about where there has been success. There are challenges, there are always challenges, but it is a way of giving some hope. So, it's the 25th anniversary. Why is Ireland celebrating a peace agreement in Northern Ireland? Because we're one of the co-guarantors of that peace agreement. Because we couldn't have built a peace in Northern Ireland without involving Ireland and the UK. Not possible. So, we're co-guarantors. There are different strands to the agreement. I understand you'll be having lectures on this later, so I won't spoil the surprise. But it is important, that dimension of support, and we like to show our support this year. We thought long and hard, Sophia, who is sitting in the front row, and I from the consulate, about what would be the most impactful way to celebrate the 25th anniversary, and we thought, well, just made new friends in Lyon 3, we'll do it there. And I think one of the things that it was very innovative for us was the inclusion of women's voices at the negotiating table. Since then, it has become more acceptable, more routine, but it was quite groundbreaking. And who better to invite to talk about that experience, to talk about the many years of work that went up to it, because it was a very short period, well, 2 years of negotiations, but a very short period, but based on a lot of hard work, a lot of work on inclusion done up to that point. Then, Dr. KILMURRAY, who was one of the founding members of the Women's Coalition which sat at the peace negotiations, that was a cross-community group, also very innovative in the Northern Irish context, and somebody who is heavily involved since then in transmitting that message in other peace negotiations, in the work that she still does as an activist in Northern Ireland. And I will leave her to speak a little bit more about that. So, you could put your hands together for Dr. Avila KILMURRAY. Thank you.
Right, I'll have to bring it down. I'm of the leprechaun generation of the Irish. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join you today, and to the Consul General for her kind invitation. I'm delighted to be with you. And I've called my short talk, Making Peace 25 Years On and Counting, because while we arrived at the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, it is still very much a process that we're involved in, and it has had its ups and downs over the last 25 years. And my first slide really is just showing, first of all, on the cover of a report that was done that talks about Northern Ireland, north of Ireland. As I say, it's still a process. We can't actually even agree what to call the place. The unionist population, indeed the official name, is Northern Ireland. Many people who would be nationalists, Republicans, call it the North of Ireland, the island of Ireland. And it has, like the Republic of Ireland, been Northern Ireland since 1921, when 2/3 of the population of Northern Ireland would be unionist, pro part of the United Kingdom, pro part of Britain. 1/3 would have preferred to being part of the island of Ireland. But even within Northern Ireland, you can see from this little map here from the general election in 2019 how the place is divided. Essentially, the east, particularly the northeast, returns unionist, pro-British representation, and the west and the south, the dark green, is the Sinn Féin vote, which would be a Republican vote. And you have small spots then of a lighter green, which are sort of Social Democratic and Labour Party, Nationalist Party, and then a yellow, which is the Alliance Party, which is a cross-community party. But it's very stark, that sort of, election result in terms of how the sort of profile of political preference in Northern Ireland is still shifting, is still quite sharply divided. So what we really have is a clustering of different understandings and, to an extent, grievances. The clustering of how people understand history, and particularly the history of the Troubles. And we've seen that very recently in terms of legislation around how to deal with legacy issues, which again has been very divisive. We've seen clusters of differences around ideas of national identity and citizenship. And actually one of the geniuses I always felt of the Good Friday Agreement, and I remember talking about this in places like Cyprus and Sri Lanka, was that we can be Irish or British or both. So people can have, my children for argument's sake, can have two passports, which again is quite unusual in international terms. And in terms then of sort of citizenship and how people see things, I always remember, in terms of an opinion poll that was done immediately after the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And 70% of unionist, mainly Protestant community, said the big issue was to get rid of paramilitarism. 76% of the Catholic Nationalist Republican community said the big issue was to get a Bill of Rights and equality. Very different perspectives in terms of what was important. Differences in terms of cultural symbols and traditions. And I mean, people say symbols. Well, in 2012, we almost had yet another breakdown of our governance because of what flag was going to be flown. There was protests, street protests over the flying of flags, or in fact, in that case, in 2012, the withdrawal of flying the Union Jack every day over the City Hall in Belfast. The impact of Brexit. And again, Northern Ireland actually voted to remain in the European Union, not by a massive amount, by 56%. In fact, Scotland was actually higher again. But then we've had the working out of the impact of that over the last number of years. That has been very divisive. And finally, a sense of marginalization. And I remember reading a report that was done, I think back in 1972, gives you an idea of how old I am, which basically talked about a double minority syndrome, where the Catholic nationalists were clearly a minority at that stage in Northern Ireland, but the perception of unionists was that they were a tiny minority in the island of Ireland. So both sides actually felt this sense of marginalization. This is the headline in the Belfast Telegraph in the late August 1994, and it was the IRA ceasefire. Actually, it was probably a wee bit optimistic at the time in terms of saying it's over, because actually that ceasefire broke down for a period in 1996. But what I wanted to point out, a bit like you were saying about the Sunningdale Agreement being sort of a marker in terms of the peace process in Northern Ireland. And of course, the Sunningdale Agreement in 1973 was actually brought down 6 months later because of the Irish dimension being recognised in it. But actually from 1985 on, you had a series of agreements between the Irish government and the British government that started really recognising the Irish interest, the Irish dimension in the future of peace in Northern Ireland. the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, we had the Downing Street Declaration in 1993, and then with the Intergovernmental Frameworks document. But importantly, really importantly in terms of background music, background narrative, was the fact that there was a declaration in some of those agreements, 1993 one, but also before that, by the British Secretary of State, that Britain had no strategic or economic interest in the future of Northern Ireland. And that was actually sending a message back to Republicans to say things could change. And alongside that, as I note here, you had ongoing back-channel negotiations. We've had them on and off since 1972. They have generally been denied between Republicans and not necessarily the British government, but British representatives. We also had it in terms of intermediaries, certainly from the late 1980s, when the violence was really spinning out of control through trusted intermediaries like priests in Belfast. And then we also had negotiations between representatives of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, and the head of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the Nationalist Party, John Hume. So there was negotiations going on, sounding out what was happening. And interestingly, with some of those negotiations was the role of civil society and community-based organisations. And I remember working in the late 1980s with one organisation that deliberately worked on both sides of our peace wall in West Belfast, called the Springfield Inter-Community Development Group. And they very deliberately on their management committee had Pat McKeown, who was an IRA hunger striker, and Billy Hutchinson, who was on day release from prison as an Ulster Volunteer Force prisoner. And what was happening with that was that you had leaders negotiating, but you had people on the ground listening to what they were picking up, to actually say to their leaders, you can believe that, because we're picking this up in the local communities as well. So it was quite a process that involved quite a range of people, but very quietly. The peace talks that we are celebrating in terms of leading to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, again, we can't even agree on the name of it, started in 1996. So you had the ceasefires, 1994, started with the Irish Republican Army ceasefire, followed up by the Loyalist ceasefires. We had the breakdown of some of those ceasefires because the British government of the day said they wanted decommissioning of illegal weapons before allowing people into talks. And then we had the agreement to establish the framework of talks. It was very interesting, I always refer to it as showing how democracy can be adapted to situations. Because in order to try and get representatives of the smaller parties, particularly those parties that represented loyalist unionist paramilitaries, into the talks, we had a new electoral system. So we had representatives elected from our constituencies to a forum for dialogue and understanding. The Women's Coalition ended up calling it the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding, whatever. But we also had a vote right across Northern Ireland, a cumulative vote, to return the 2 representatives from each of the 10 parties that got the highest vote into the talks. And that was guaranteed to get small parties at the table. Because if people who were being left out, then they would have no fingerprints on what was being discussed. We also had then, as the Consul General has referred to, the international involvement. We had framing from America. We had George Mitchell over, who chaired the talks. We had Jean de Chastillon from Canada, who particularly sort of looked at the whole issue around decommissioning of weapons. And we had Harry Hulkery from Finland as the sort of holding, if you like, a sort of a neutral space so that they could act between the different parties when negotiations broke down. And alongside that, really as soon as the ceasefires were called in 1994, Jacques Delors asked the 3 Northern Irish members of the European Parliament to Brussels and said, what can I do? And from that, he set up and started at the beginning of 1995, before the talks, the first special support programme for peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland, very much based on one that was actually in South Africa. The peace programme is actually still going, though in slightly different form, but certainly in that first decade, it actually took on board issues that the British government wouldn't touch. My organisation that I was director of, which was the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, managed the measures of European funding for the reintegration of all the political ex-prisoners, of the victims of violence, as well as women's and community-based groups. And I had, from 1995 on, 2 representatives around the table from the IRA, provisional IRA, from the official IRA. We were great at splintering our paramilitary groups, from the Ulster Volunteer Force, from the Ulster Defence Association, and from the Irish National Liberation Army. And because we actually had this amorphous funding measure, they continued to meet even during the breakdown of the ceasefires. So you were using something like a European Union funding programme to provide a back-channel negotiation between people on the basis that they were agreeing funding to reintegrate political prisoners, but they could also talk to each other over coffee. We also had in the peace talks, and I think very often it's forgotten sometimes when all the attention is on the big names, but actually the amount of work that was actually done by both British and Irish officials in terms of framing the discussion papers that went backwards and forwards during the talks was really important. As against that, we had this broader, as I say, forum for misunderstanding and monologue, which was a more general political representatives, which actually the nationalist and Republican parties withdrew from because it was just a chamber for insult, really, at the background, but had no power. And we also had, over those years, we had the talks, but we also had politics in the street. Very much sort of, it was a very tense period, and almost a proxy control of politicians being used by some of the street protests over the right to march, the legitimacy of who was speaking for who, which was quite destabilizing in terms of some of the talks. So it was a difficult period. In fact, I remember, I think it was the summer, July 1997, and coming up to July, the headline of the Belfast Telegraph was, "Will the last person leaving Northern Ireland for holidays please turn off the light?" Because there was that sense of people actually wanting to get out of the place. Moving on to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement itself. Just some headlines from it. As I say, it acknowledged the validity of different traditions and aspirations, which was really important because up until that point, really the sort of any aspiration for Irish unity within Northern Ireland was seen as being rebel, sort of undermining the state and not acceptable. It also importantly, and it's a matter of discussion at the moment today, said that the right of the decision-making around the future of Northern Ireland would lie with the people of Northern Ireland. And that if a British Secretary of State at some point felt that there was likely to be a majority in favour of a united Ireland, then a referendum should be called. And the referendum, it's now something of a matter of controversy, but was established as 50% plus 1 would be enough to actually change the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. The same percentage, actually, that was moved Brexit. It also talked about 3 tiers, if you like, of the governance of Northern Ireland. The first was within Northern Ireland itself, and that was is to be a power-sharing executive, an assembly at that stage of 108 delegates with a power-sharing executive made up of the sort of those parties that are returned, starting with the biggest party. And that was reflecting what was agreed back long ago in 1973 in the Sunningdale Agreement. It talked about a second tier, which was North-South relations. And that was that there would be a number of cross-border bodies, quite often unfunctional in nature, rivers, waterways, trade, tourism, and so forth. That actually was very controversial and almost brought down the agreement, because initially they were to be sort of standalone bodies, but then particularly the Unionist Party felt that they had to be under the Northern Ireland Executive so that they couldn't go off and do things themselves, basically. And whenever the Northern Ireland Executive is not working, the cross-border bodies are brought down as well. And then there was to be an east-west dimension between Britain and Ireland, and indeed including Channel Isles and so forth. And there's a number of councils and so forth to bring that in. The fourth thing I have there, which was really important, and I say particularly in terms of the nationalist community, was a whole section on rights, safeguards, and equality of opportunity. And that actually became very controversial, because equality of opportunity, everybody nods happily until it actually starts being implemented in practice. And then some people say, well, we were, for example, in policing. The police force in Northern Ireland would have been 97% Protestant. And then equality of opportunity. Then we had a degree of affirmative action in terms of bringing in people from the nationalist Catholic community. And then people start saying, ooh, our jobs are at risk or whatever else. So it's one of these things, as I say, that sounds nice rhetorically until you start implementing what was really important. We had security issues, which again were very controversial. We had the early release of political prisoners, and that was something that was particularly controversial within the Unionist community. We had the demand for decommissioning of illegal weapons, linked actually to the dismantlement of British Army infrastructure, particularly along the border areas. And again, that was very long drawn out and really didn't happen until the mid-2000s. And we had the issue of policing. And that then was put off, if you like, to an independent commission to look at that issue. And it did achieve major change. And lastly, we had this grouping of civic forum, the idea of having a second chamber that would be advisory, that would be broader and drawn from civil society, a range of social and economic issues, and support for victims of violence. They were all the issues that the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition actually got into the agreement. And particularly the issue of support for victims and survivors of violence. They actually weren't mentioned, except that the Women's Coalition actually raised it. Prisoners were, but not the victims. Brings it on then to the Women's Coalition. And as the little snippet from the video suggested, it really was set up in the context of long-term women's activism. Because one of the things that we always find in conflict societies, not just in Northern Ireland, is the constitutional conflict. The politics with a big P conflict takes all the oxygen, and other issues are just ignored. So women's issues were one of the things that were ignored. And Northern Ireland was quite a conservative, with a small C society. So things like access to reproductive rights, things like divorce legislation. When I was active in the women's movement in the late 70s, we were talking about Victorian legislation. When we set up the first domestic violence refuge for women in Northern Ireland in 1977, we had to actually occupy a public building illegally because we were told there wasn't a problem in Northern Ireland. And when we did it, we were denounced off the altars of Catholic churches for breaking up marriage. And we were denounced in the House of Commons in Westminster by the official unionist representative, Willie Ross at the time, because of being in breach of the emergency provisions legislation for occupying a public building. And yet, after a year of running that illegally, we had 90 women and 300 children through it. So again, those sort of issues, they were just completely ignored. And then more recently, and Northern Ireland is not a particularly diverse society beyond the sort of the binary split. More recently, issues in terms of new communities coming in, of black communities, were completely ignored. Because whenever it came to talking about equality of opportunity, it was all about balancing Catholics and Protestants. So, you know, if you get one issue that just dominates, it can actually undermine many others. But the other thing we were conscious of is that in a conflict society over many years, politics gets very narrow. Because a lot of people say, you know, I don't want to get involved in that. It's dangerous, it's sectarian, you know, I just don't see myself there. So instead, women had been long-term activists in the community movement and in the trade union movement, in the civil rights movement, going back before that. So there was an expertise there. We mentioned about having cross-community shared leadership. We sort of looked round and sort of said, right, if we're going to do something, we don't want to be just tagged as nationalist or unionist. They've got their own representatives. I mean, the parties that we have, they all know what they want to say about the constitutional question. We want to represent these broader issues. But we want women, when they're looking at the coalition, to see themselves reflected there. So we had two leaders, one from the Catholic nationalist community, one from the Protestant unionist community. So that it was clearly a shared leadership. Journalists could not get their heads around it. Political journalists would ring us up and say, we want to talk to your leader. We say, yeah, which one? Both? Well, either. Journalists or political correspondents tend to be really stuck in the established politics. As was mentioned there, we had three principles. We said, look, it's no point in us spending until midnight drawing up a policy about chicken farming when we're never going to be the Minister for Agriculture. So what we will do is we'll take three principles: human rights, equality, and inclusion. And again, they proved to be quite controversial, because on human rights, for argument's sake, Bernadette McAliskey was in that little clip you saw there, previously Bernadette Devlin. Bernadette came to us, and her daughter at the time was being held in prison in England on an alleged charge of IRA activity. And she was, I think at that stage, about 6 months pregnant, and she was being strip searched repeatedly. And Bernadette said, you have a principle about human rights. Do something about Roisin. So, and that sort of thing could have actually split our membership, because people from a unionist community would be saying, oh, well, you know, that's clearly a Republican demand, whatever else. So we sent one of our members, who was a Protestant woman doctor, over to the prison in England to talk to Roisin. And she came out and said, it's an abuse of human rights. Now, if Monica McWilliams had gone out from a nationalist background, she wouldn't have been heard, because people would say, oh, she would say that, wouldn't she? But when you actually could sort of counter position, then when Jane went over, she at least was heard. People complained about it, but at least she was heard. And similarly, inclusion. Inclusion said we are going to talk to everybody. So whenever, as happened, whenever the IRA ceasefire broke down, Sinn Féin was not allowed into the talks, we back-channeled with them over the period they were out. And similarly, at one point, whenever some of the loyalist parties were put out because of breakdown in UDA ceasefire, we met with them. So we met with everybody. The other thing that we thought was important was to highlight women's voice and presence. Because while things have now changed, and we have now about a 35%, still not good enough, but we have 35% of women in the return members to our assembly, back in the early 90s, it was 5%. And there was going to be nobody, there was no woman on the nominated two representatives at the peace talks table. There were women in the negotiating teams of different parties, but none actually as of right at the table. So we felt that that was important. And then, as I say, we wanted to raise issues other than the constitutional question, because the danger was that things like victims, like social and economic rights, and we put in things like support for an anti-poverty strategy, for support for community development, a whole range of things, and the civic forum would not have been on the table. And lastly, you know, we called it a coalition deliberately rather than a party, because we said, look, we're not going to be another political party. This is an opportunity to actually broaden politics. And certainly for the first, really until 1998, we had a policy of saying, and if you want to hold dual membership with another political party, but subscribe to the principles of the Women's Coalition, that's fine. Because it was in our interest to know what the other political persuasions actually believed, in order that we were forearmed before going into the negotiations. So conscious of time, I'll end with the benefit of hindsight, some things that we learned. First of all, the need to organise at every political level. During peace talks and negotiations, very often all the energy and attention is on the top of the apex of the triangle, of where the talks are being negotiated. Colombia is what was happening in Havana with the various people, whatever. However, what we found, we didn't actually have the facility to do a lot about it, was the importance of not only having representation at the top, but also looking at the local authorities, the municipal authorities, the other areas where people can actually both get elected but also have an influence. Because even in terms of succession planning, you need people coming up through those local authority levels. But they're very often ignored whenever there's high energy peace talks going on. And yet they're the level that actually can communicate with local people as to what's happening. But also, not just in terms of the political levels, but also in terms of civil society. What were the networks? The other thing that we learned very quickly, partially from our principle of inclusion, was the importance of understanding who needs to sell what to who and how. So, for argument's sake, in terms of Sinn Féin, we knew that their main internal concern was not to have a split in the Irish Republican Army. Because over the decades in Northern Ireland, republicanism has split and split over different ideological or tactical positions. So there was no point in saying you have to decommission your weapons by 4 o'clock next Friday, because they couldn't do it. Or if they did it, they would actually have a split of people setting up dissident groups, which happened to a small amount, but they actually managed that process very well. They needed the time to go out and explain to their people on the ground what was happening and why, and that would take them time. Similarly, we were conscious that in terms of unionism, they also had to sell to their people, you are not going to be in a United Ireland next Friday. There is going to be some safeguards in terms of your identity. And they were under pressure from people outside the talks, from people like the Orange Order and so forth, who would have taken probably a more dogmatic line. So just being conscious that you weren't just going in with your demands, you had to be conscious of the pressures on the people that you were negotiating with. Thirdly, and this one isn't often brought up, the real need to identify and protect the influential, what I call insiders, outsiders. The people that had credibility within, particularly the sort of either republicanism or loyalism, but actually had the facility to think ahead so that they weren't caught tactically in just, a small number of demands. The person that always stands out for me is David Irvine, who tragically died quite early. And he was the leader of the Progressive Unionist Party. He was an ex-political prisoner for the Ulster Volunteer Force for loyalism. But he was able to take what was being negotiated at the table and explain to his constituency what it meant for them, but also to actually look forward and articulate sort of a longer-term view in terms of that community. Similarly, we would have used insider outsiders to encourage the Irish Republican Army to stop their practice of internal policing and kneecapping 20, 21-year-olds for antisocial activities. Because we had someone there, a number of people there, who were themselves ex-IRA political prisoners, who were able to actually bring in ideas from civil society and say to us, look, you know, you can make that argument now, but you might have to wait a couple of months for that to be discussed internally and then come back with something else. So you needed informants, if you like, in terms of being able to both communicate externally, but also communicate internally. Implementation. We were so exhausted by the time we got the Good Friday Agreement that we didn't discuss the timetable for implementation. The one thing that was implemented was the Patten Commission, which was a review of policing. And that had to take place in terms of trying to get acceptance of a new policing. But the rest of the Good Friday Agreement was in danger of slipping, and did. Particularly over time, as you get different political leadership generations coming into the situation, and they may not be the ones that actually signed up to the agreement itself. So we didn't get a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. Now, largely that was because, again, new British government coming in, not the same ownership as the Labour Party would have had, who were there when it was negotiated. And the onus within the negotiations was that Westminster would agree a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. It had been discussed by the new Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. They, in their wisdom, said, oh, no, we will hand it back to Stormont, to Northern Ireland, power sharing executive, who could never agree on it. So things like that just slipped, you know. And then the other thing that slipped was, as we go forward, and there's been a number of other subsidiary agreements, we've had small concessions. So St Andrew's Agreement in 2007, which was largely between Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party that had opposed the Good Friday Agreement, they brought down the number of elected representatives in Stormont from 108 to 90. So what you say? Well, actually, that eliminated all the small parties. So that eliminated the representation from those loyalist parties that you actually had brought in to the Good Friday Agreement, which was disaster. And I suppose lastly then, in terms of narrative and communications, and very often politicians, they get so tightly concerned, and understandably so, in negotiating with each other that they forget what's happening outside their tight circle. I always remember we brought over Rolf Mayer from South Africa, who was the National Party. He'd been Minister of Defence under de Klerk, but then negotiated with Cyril Ramaphosa for the South African agreement. I remember bringing him down to unionist parties, and Rolf saying, look, you know, every Saturday I would go back to the Bundesbad or whatever in South Africa to explain what was happening. Because if I didn't, other people would be spreading messages and rumours. And at that stage, the Unionist Party and David Trimble sort of looking at him and sort of saying, why? Because you had to actually bring people with you. So that sort of, you know, understanding, but also the narrative, how you actually frame what has been agreed, is really important. And whenever there isn't an agreement about that sort of narrative and communication, you can then get, as we currently have in Northern Ireland, a misrepresentation by people perhaps that would be against the agreement anyway. And the communications. And I always often wonder whether we would have been able to sell the Good Friday Agreement if we had the social media then that we have now. Because, you know, it was a nuanced agreement, and it is quite hard to sell nuance on the sort of the Twitter or X or whatever it is now in terms of social media. So that was really important. And I had a group of Palestinian women leaders over for a week last June, and had a number of people in talking about aspects of politics and agreement. And actually the person I had in from Sinn Féin said, we now spend 70% of our funding on communications. Because again, that sort of politics, you know, have. So just finally then, I suppose we're talking really about 4 phases. The first phase, Good Friday Agreement, which was followed really between 1998 and 2007 by the whole emphasis on the rule of law, policing, disarmament. Second phase, about 2007 to 2012, when, you know, we're trying to get societal governance, power sharing between largely Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party. Then we had a phase of annual crises, 2012 to 2017, dormant governance up and down a lot. And our current phase is really Brexit and post-Brexit. And what that has done in terms of certainly making the unionist community feel very vulnerable around their identity and their future within United Kingdom, and making the nationalist Republican community almost feel, look, we've given this a good shot, but it's not working. So looking perhaps more towards a sort of a referendum in terms of the future of Northern Ireland. And that, of course, continues then to increase the cleavage, if you like, between the various communities. Women's Coalition went out, we wound ourselves up in 2006, because by that stage we really couldn't see any potential for what we were trying to do within the elected politics. The whole emphasis, particularly within the two governments, was how to get Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party to work together. We basically took the decision, we came from civil society, you know, we are actually a movement rather than just a party, and there are other ways that we can use our energy to try and continue to influence the process. Perhaps I'll leave it there and we can have any discussion.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for this very interesting presentation and your enthusiasm, I would say, on all these issues, which are so important, as we said, in the current context. Well, I think there are many questions. Well, I have, if I may start, I have a first one. Considering the fact that you were born in Dublin, and you insisted a lot on the need you see to have, and you also insisted on this necessity to have a dialogue between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, or the North of Ireland, whatever the name. My first question was, how did it come that you were willing, you see, to invest so much of your time and your whole life to all these movements for the peace process and being involved in this coalition? I mean, as early as the 1970s, being born in Dublin, you say, in the Republic, and not in Northern Ireland. If I may ask you quite a personal question to start with. Really interesting, showing the link, in fact, between the South and the North.
Well, thank you for that. I actually describe myself as an early cross-border body. I was on my career to be a respectable academic. I had done my master's in Australia in international relations and had got a PhD scholarship. Made the mistake of going back on holidays. In 1975, when there was an IRA truce period, I got involved in a conference in America, which was bringing all by a man called Padraig O'Malley, which was bringing all the sort of protagonists together. And then I was approached by the Quakers, and I'm not a Quaker by background, who always had back-channel people in conflict situations to know would I take 2 years leave of absence from my PhD to work with their person in Derry, Northern Ireland. And I agreed, my university agreed, but unfortunately my PhD was blown up. I was blown up and lost, it was before computers, and I lost all my notes, so I decided to stay in Northern Ireland. And then got involved really from there in the community and the women's movement. And I suppose it's actually interesting, you know, reflecting back, when you are in an intensely conflict situation, in some ways, well, there was two things. In some ways, it's almost easier to stay in it. It's when you work on adrenaline in many ways, and it's only when you leave you realize how much you are working on adrenaline. But secondly, I mean, I'd done history and politics, and I did always feel at times, I used to sort of wonder, but you did almost feel that it was history being made. And you know, I work now with a number, particularly women in conflict societies, you know, as on Zoom calls with people in Ramallah last week, and sort of saying, well, actually, very often when things move, it's after the worst of situations. I mean, the period between 1990 and 1993 was awful. You know, we had Schenkelbaum, we had constant sort of sectarian assassinations, whatever else, and yet, you know, you then had the ceasefire. So sometimes it does take a sort of a heightening of conflict to actually force people into looking at alternatives.
Thank you for your answer. And if I may just jump to another question, because you were mentioning the fact that you were having talks with, people in Hamela, and that was one of my questions to say, because it seems when we look at the documentary and your presentation today that women played a major role, in fact, in the, not in the signing, but in the context. We know that it's very difficult for these Jewish and Muslim communities to have women involved, but the extent to which they are essential maybe to find a light, if I'm saying so, at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, I think it is. And alongside, let's say we did have Palestinian women over in June, but we're also working with a number of discussions with a Palestinian-Israeli women's dialogue group, actually through the Irish ambassador in Tel Aviv back last May-June period. And they were on last week, and they're still meeting, you know, and actually, in some ways, and it's true, I think, in Northern Ireland as well. I mean, I worked in both nationalist and loyalist communities. It is sometimes more difficult for people in the Northern Ireland context in loyalist communities, currently probably progressive Israelis, to actually question their own side than people who would have this, you know, self-perception of being, if you like, the oppressed or the minority or whatever else. And it is also trying to protect and create space for them. In terms of the women's voice, I think one of the things that worked to our advantage was identifying other women champions. So it made a huge difference to us when we had, with the election of Tony Blair as the Labour government in 1997, we had the first ever woman Secretary of State British Secretary of State in Northern Ireland, Mo Mowlam. And Mo basically acted as our back channel. So when the civil servants who were mainly male would say, oh, don't bother talking to the Women's Coalition, sure, they're tiny. We had the secret code of Mo. We'd meet on the stairs and do that. And that meant we'll meet you in the ladies' loo. And she would give us the documents. So, you know, people, you know, we sort of established our own little sort of, you know, network of both champions and Secret Service. And then the other one, to be quite honest, that was actually really important in terms internationally for us, well, was two women. Martha Pope, who was rarely heard of, who was actually Senator George Mitchell's chief of staff. Again, the senator was backwards and forwards to the States. Martha was there all the time, and she would have Sunday lunch with us. And secondly, Hillary Clinton. Because whenever Bill Clinton, as president, invited over all the leaders of the parties involved in negotiations in 1997 to the White House on St. Patrick's Day, his officials actually forgot to have our two shared leaders invited to his talks, and they ended up with Hillary Clinton. And the officials haven't said to Hillary, would you have 10 minutes to give to these people? And an hour later, she was still with them, and she spoke that night in the White House and referred to Women's Coalition and maintained on a broader basis.
Yes, it's very well shown in the documentary. I mean, the role played by all these external women, if I may say so. But I find it really amazing to see that you were very open-minded, all of you, and able to have this cross-community partnership that politicians were unable, to create. Having the two leaders, as you were saying, back in the early 1990s, that was something very, very, innovative, and that was really necessary, but you were the only one, women were the only one able to do it, so it's really interesting.
And I think just on that, the two things that stood to us in terms of experience for that cross-community working was from 1980 to, really up to the Good Friday Agreement, there was a community-based movement in Greater Belfast area, which was made up of locally based women's groups from poorer areas. And they started off meeting in what we called neutral spaces, you know, city centre. And then they were curious. They said, no, we're going to rotate our meetings. It was the last Friday of every month they met. This Friday in a Republican area, the next Friday in a Loyalist area. Because the politicians are telling us the other side are getting everything and you're getting nothing. They're playing one side off against another, and we want to see what the truth is. And that was supported by just, you know, funding for minibuses to bring people backwards and forwards. But the second experience we had, and for a period I was the first women's officer of the main Transport and General Workers Union in Northern Ireland, in Ireland actually. And we learned within that trade union that we kept people together by going back to principles. Otherwise, my union would have been 70% Protestant unionist. So to keep people together, we learned the importance of going back to principles, and we used that then in the Women's Coalition.
Maybe another question. You spoke about the fact that one of the demands at an early stage was the decommissioning of weapons. And do you think that as far as weapons were concerned, women had a specific approach to weapons or to the necessity of avoiding weapons, and that was it an important subject?
It was an important subject, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that women had a specific approach to it. And I always sort of say, you know, because sometimes, mainly Americans actually, seem to think that women are more pacifist than men. Not necessarily. And actually, women that get involved quite often actually are not. It takes more for them to get involved. So that they can be more hardline in many ways. In terms of the weapons, we tended to take the approach, well, that point I was saying, what's the effectiveness? We know that they're not going to be all brought in, as I say, on demand. And secondly, the importance of words. So the British argued for the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons. When the IRA, and there's still plenty of weapons in Northern Ireland, but when the IRA actually, they had 3 different decommissioning phases, the last one being in 2005. They talked about putting weapons beyond use. Now, so what's the difference? Well, actually, one had a sense about it of you've lost. Putting them beyond use was an agency. We have decided to put them beyond use, which was somewhat different. That's we are destroying them or seeing them destroyed. So things like that. And I say the coalition took the line of, it's no point, well, first of all, we didn't want to get aligned with a British government demand, which would then paint you into that corner. But secondly, as I say, we felt that as long as the process was happening, that was enough. Actually, the more important process was the acceptance of the new police. If you actually accept policing, then you're accepting the state. And that was actually, in our mind, more of an important issue than the decommissioning. Because you can always get weapons again, I mean, it's, you know, in terms of wherever. But once you sort of sign up to the state, and actually I think Sinn Féin found that harder to sell, probably, than the decommissioning issue.
Very much. You also spoke about different levels, the top political level and the grassroots. And I'd like to know what can you tell us today about cross-community links in Northern Ireland? Are they effective? Are they numerous? Or is there still some form of communitarism?
It depends really what level of society you're talking about. I mean, at the level of society in terms of economics, of business or whatever, there is a lot of cross-community working. We still have in Belfast, in the region of 100 peace walls and our barriers. between communities. And that is literally on the basis of territoriality. That this side of the wall will be 99% loyalist Protestant, this side will be Nationalist, Republican, Catholic, whatever else. I'm on the board of something called the International Fund for Ireland, which is a multilateral donor support for peace in Northern Ireland. And one of our programs is trying to work with communities on both sides of the wall. We still have a sense, people will say, yes, we'd love to see those walls down, but not in our lifetime, in our children's lifetime. So there's an apprehension still, but also we've had generations growing up that literally, have grown up in separate circumstances, will go to separate schools. Only 9% of our children go to what we call integrated schools, which is sort of deliberately Catholic Protestant. The rest will go to largely segregated schools. So people may not meet each other until they go to work or go to university or whatever else. So reconciliation has not necessarily been taken on board beyond a certain level. So say if you're working together, whatever else, that is fine. We also have very strong equality laws that outlaw sort of religious, political discrimination and so forth. The other problem, I think, with reconciliation is we still have potentially a situation where we can find ourselves constitutionally facing a referendum, which will be divisive. And while there's the real practical divisions there, you will get reconciliation perhaps at a certain level, but at the end of the day, politically, it's a bit of a zero-sum game. It's either or, and people are conscious of that. There has been a lot of cross-community working at civil society level, at trade union level. However, at civil society level, it has become much more difficult with the Brexit tensions, because the perception of a lot of loyalist, particularly poorer loyalist communities, some of the rural communities, is that they are on a sort of a slippery slope into United Ireland, and that means that they have sort of pulled back. So that has caused problems. And then the other issue that we're conscious of is the demographic change. And I mentioned the establishment of Northern Ireland, 2/3 unionist, 1/3 nationalist. Now there's something like 48% Protestant, 46% Catholic. That doesn't mean to say all Protestants are unionists and all Catholics are nationalists, but is a bit of an indicator. So actually, the small sliver of people in the middle that don't fall into those categories hold the balance of power. And I think there's almost like this sense of the tide of history, and that, I think, leaves some communities feeling very vulnerable.
So it means that 25 years after the signing of the agreement, there are still some people feeling unsafe or not safe enough to believe in it. I mean, maybe fearing that it may just collapse any day.
Yes, I mean, and that's why actually, as the Consul General said, the agreement was lodged with the UN. It is not just a settlement between people in Northern Ireland. It is an international agreement with guarantors. And trying to sort of meddle with it or undermine it, I think, is quite dangerous, because if people do feel uncertain, then you're always worried that, particularly sort of a younger generation that perhaps are being fed through social media lines that, the agreement, is a sellout to them or a sellout to the other side or whatever, that there is a danger of sliding back. However, I've been involved in some, opinion polls recently, and the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland, indeed, obviously the vast majority of the Republic of Ireland, do not want to see any return to violence. The other interesting thing is, of course, we always focus on Northern Ireland. There have been recent surveys done of opinion poll in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and actually, not the vast majority, but the majority of people in England, Scotland and Wales haven't necessarily got a view in keeping Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. So when you look at it from that perspective, it is also rather different.
Yes, and just for students, I strongly advise you to have a look at a recent publication entitled The State of the Union by two academics, one in Scotland and one in Wales. And it's a very, very interesting study because it studies the viewpoint not just of people in Ireland about Ireland, but as you were saying, in England about Ireland, or in Wales and Scotland about Ireland, and their opinion on the possible reunification and so on. And that's exactly what you were saying. It's very interesting to see that it's not that they do not care, but they're saying, well, if there is a majority of people willing to see this reunification, let it go. I mean, fair enough. And it's very interesting to see opinions in other nations of the UK, in fact, on the situation.
And just on that broader basis, of course, there's now the issue about, well, if there was reunification, then the whole of the island is in the European Union, which was also left open.
You can have questions in English or in French. I mean, we can translate if they are in French. I mean, we can translate. You can translate the answers, but we can translate the question. You can. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. It's just I was saying to Avila, translate.
I have a question, but it's not exactly about the Good Friday Agreement. It's mostly about the fact that you were an all-women group. I was wondering, would you say that the Women's Coalition is directly linked to the increase of female representatives in Irish politics? And has your movement maybe inspired women beyond the political field to make themselves heard in male-dominated fields?
Sorry, I missed the start of that.
Would you say that the Women's Coalition is directly linked to the increase of female representatives in politics, in Irish politics?
At the Women's Coalition?
Directly linked to representation in politics in general, or in Irish politics?
Irish politics, thank you.
I meant specifically Irish politics because you mentioned that it went from 5% to 35%.
Yeah, I think probably that was politically, apart from the bits that got in the agreement, was probably the most important thing it did, because what we found was that women in the other parties said to their leaders, who were all men at that stage, well, if we're not promoted, you're going to lose votes to that crowd over there, the Women's Coalition. So they used it as a bit of a blackmail within their own parties to say that it was important that their voices would be heard. And certainly, particularly the nationalist parties, the Republican parties, Sinn Féin, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the Alliance Party, which is sort of cross-community, they particularly pushed, I think, women, certainly from after the Good Friday Agreement. And indeed, the Progressive Unionist Party, which was the party associated with the Ulster Volunteer Force on the Loyalist side, they actually had a woman leader, Dawn Purvis, for a period. So yes, I think it did make a difference in terms of other parties, and the fact that the women's voice was being recognised through the coalition externally by internationally also put a pressure, I think, on the various parties to actually start taking it seriously. The other thing I think that I didn't get to mention really that was important in terms of the coalition and probably had a bit of a trickle-down effect in terms of other parties was what George Mitchell used to describe, that we were the glue in the negotiations, because we were coming in as women from outside formal politics. So we were hearing things that other politicians were saying, that because the established parties had been talking at each other for so many years, they didn't hear. They assumed that they knew. So John Hume, or he wasn't really well at the time, but Seamus Mallon, who did the negotiations for the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the Nationalist Party, would assume that he knew what David Trimble was saying for the Unionist Party, or or whatever, or the Unionists would assume what Gerry Adams was saying for the for Sinn Féin. And what we were sort of saying is, because we had our principle of inclusion to talk to them all, we were sort of saying back to David Trimble or whatever, well, Gerry Adams did say this, but he also said that. And they didn't necessarily pick up the nuance because, and it's actually a problem with established politicians anyway. They're so busy talking from their perspective that they don't listen to what the opposition is saying because they're so busy formulating their response to undermine the opposition that they don't, you know, that they're not pulling out the positive elements. And as outsiders, we were able to sort of say, no, but there's a bit of movement there that you really should be looking at. And I think women that have come through in other parties have picked up, not all of them, but a number of them have picked up on that as well, the importance of that sort of almost like listening role and then being able to translate it. But yes, I mean, at the moment, in fact, women lead in Northern Ireland, and in Ireland actually, Sinn Féin, but then there is, you know, women leader of the Alliance Party. There was Arlene Foster, who's not there anymore, but she was the Democratic Unionist Party. So women have come through, and I don't think they would have without the coalition's influence. You're an easier group than when we're negotiating the Good Friday Agreement.
I have a question regarding the influence of the international sphere, and maybe you could go back to this matter, for example, with Finland, Canada, and the US. How come they got so influential, or not maybe influential, but pushing for peace building?
Well, the US always had the sort of the Irish-American caucus, and that wasn't speaking with one voice because you had a very pro-IRA Sinn Féin voice within the US, many of which actually didn't like the idea of the IRA going on ceasefire in 1994. But then you had a broader voice as well that was drawn deliberately from both the Democrat and Republican parties, who would have been more probably lined with nationalism with the Social Democratic and Labour Party. So they were always very involved, and actually they argued, which actually helped lead to the IRA ceasefire in 1994, to Bill Clinton giving a visa for Gerry Adams to travel to the US. Before that, he would have been barred under their terrorism legislation. So he got that visa to explain to his constituents in the US sort of what was happening. And that then obviously engaged Bill Clinton, who really did get very involved. I mean, I literally remember phone calls from him, you know, at 3 o'clock in the morning in Stormont, whenever we had a hiatus in terms of the negotiations, talking to everybody. He would have called all the party leaders. And he then sent George Mitchell initially to try and get the British government off the hook of the decommissioning issue in 1995, and then George Mitchell became the chair of the peace talks. Canada was really brought in because Canada, well, it always has a very a foreign policy that is in favour of peace agreements, but actually it was seen as more aligned possibly to the unionist migrant community. So that was almost to try and balance the Irish-American bit. And Finland, because it was clearly neutral, and again, you know, Ireland particularly, you know, having a position as a neutral state, and sort of Finland would have come from that background as well. So those three, a bit like the way Norway would have played a major role in the Colombian situation as well. And then there was obviously a broader European Union interest because, I mean, and the European Union actually always played, even before the ceasefires, we would have quite often used the sort of Europe of the regions type approach, the Council of the Regions, to raise issues about, how we could reposition, if you like, the narrative of Northern Ireland, in terms of sort of cross-border stuff, and we sort of looked at sort of what was happening in Germany, and so we always tried to look outside the immediate situation, because the immediate Northern Ireland situation was so contested and closed. We'd say, well, look, let's look at other places. What have they done? The Alsace area, whatever. How are things worked there? And the European Union was always a great cover for that. And also because the European Union was always quite clever about, not being seen to be aligned constitutionally, but almost using a very sort of functional basis, the economics, whatever, which it was difficult for any party to argue against if it was going to improve the economics of Northern Ireland. So the international thing was always very important. And then on a slightly less formal basis, we had the South Africans over a lot. And obviously in the 1990s, it was, still at the height of the celebration, the change in South Africa. So Cyril Ramaphosa would have come over, and actually Cyril Ramaphosa oversaw one of the decommissioning events for the IRA, but also just talking about, and as I say, Rolf Mayer, literally saying, we had to change. And, Mandela saying, we didn't make peace with our friends, we made peace with our enemies. And then Mandela brought all the leaders of the parties that were negotiating the agreement, while it was problematic, to South Africa. And I always remember him sort of saying, actually, he says, you lot have brought apartheid back to South Africa. Why? Because the Unionists, the Democratic Unionist Party, wouldn't share the same men's toilets with Sinn Féin. So Mandela said, this is apartheid. But in fairness, Northern Ireland benefited from really, there wasn't anybody internationally that was actually playing against the peace process, which obviously in other conflict situations, quite often, people are proxies. We generally had, support internationally.
And just to add something, maybe we could say that this was vital when the Brexit negotiations Union, because it was, the European Union, I think, played a major role in safeguarding, the Good Friday Agreement during the Brexit negotiations, explaining that it was, as you said, also an international, in fact, agreement, and that it had to be respected, especially by the UK government. Okay, so that was something essential to have this international dimension, exactly, even during Brexit.
I wanted to ask you about people's mindset about Brexit. When I was in high school, we went to Ireland and we stayed in a family close to the border in Monaghan, I think. And I know they were quite fearful about what was going to happen with Brexit. Do you know a bit about people's mindset about, Brexit and what's going to happen?
Yes, Brexit has been disastrous for us, basically. And in fairness, we did point that out before the referendum, but nobody was paying any attention. Essentially, the goods situation has more or less been sorted. There needs to be a check on goods that come in from Britain to Northern Ireland that will be going down south and into the European Union market. And that is the check, and that was the danger, that the check would be on the border. And you would have, and I remember as a child, the customs posts and checks on the border for goods back in the sort of the 1960s. And that was all done away with. And that's where then the compromise was reached, that the check would be as the goods, what the unionists call the border in the Irish Sea, as the goods come into Northern Ireland, if they are going on into the market in the Republic of Ireland. If they're staying in Northern Ireland, then there is this green channel, which says that they don't need checked if they're just going into Northern Ireland. So essentially, Northern Ireland, actually, and economically, it's actually of benefit, has open access to markets, to the European market and to the UK market. The issue comes, though, around, that's for goods. not for services. We have an issue then just economically in terms of services. So now, financial services. It is now more difficult, virtually impossible, for me to do banking in the Republic of Ireland. And the banks have had to sort of divide their services because they have to just be a UK banking service. Ironically, I'm with the Bank of Ireland, and I actually can't get a cheque cashed in Dublin or a money order in Dublin. I have to do it in Northern Ireland. So there is an issue still around services that is problematic. However, the other thing that sometimes is not mentioned in terms of the working through a Brexit, there was the ability to get into the agreement between the UK and EU that there would be no diminution of the rights of people that were laid down in the Good Friday Agreement. That was very important. However, it will become a bit problematic as we go forward because new rights being introduced in Europe won't necessarily read across to Northern Ireland. New employment rights or whatever else won't necessarily read across to Northern Ireland. It can also become an issue in the foreseeable future if the British government try to have a general diminution of human rights, for example, pulling out some of the international conventions. And we have been arguing about that with them in Northern Ireland. The other block that we have, though how much was just based on Brexit, is in terms of the common travel area. We have always had a situation in Ireland that was agreement between Ireland and England that people could travel backwards and forwards with no problem. That does not apply to people that are not citizens. So a child from a new community at school in Derry, which is on the border, that does not have a right, cannot go on a school trip 10 miles down the road to the beach in Buncrana, in Donegal. So that's an issue at the moment as well, in terms of people beginning to need visas who are not Irish or British citizens in terms of crossing the border. But the good thing is that we have avoided any re-establishment of an infrastructure on the border that would highlight that sort of border area. But I mean, the reality of the border in Northern Ireland is, I can have a house that is largely based in Northern Ireland, and the bedroom is in the Republic of Ireland. So, and certainly farms on the border, they would, so what side of the border is that cow on? Well, actually. So it is a bit ridiculous, but then trying to sort of apply a sort of a strict Brexit situation. But the more disastrous side of Brexit is the uncertainty within the loyalist unionist population and the feeling that this again is part of the slippery slope to a united Ireland, whatever else, and that then has destabilized a lot of the cross-community connections and people pulling back from being involved in cross-border or cross-community activities.
We still have time for a few questions, so.
I want to ask you also, what are your hopes for the future of Ireland, considering all that? Do you wish for things to stay the same, maybe, or considering Northern Ireland? What's your opinion about it? If you want to talk about it, maybe you don't.
Well, I'm 71. Every time I hear the politicians say, oh, when we might be having a constitutional referendum about Northern Ireland, say, well, I'd be pushing up daisies at this stage, And in fact, actually, if there was to be a change in the voting system, I would argue that people under the age of 30 should have a double vote. Because they're going to have to live with the consequences, Just arguably how long I'll be around, knocking around.
It should have been the case for Brexit. It would have changed everything.
I mean, looking back, I always had this argument, probably wrongly, but that, you know, when things were going well in the Republic of Ireland, they were generally really awful in Northern Ireland and vice versa. So I do think that there is a dynamic, that, you know, and whether you can actually use the potential of change in Northern Ireland to actually, you know, underpin and support a more inclusive and society in the Republic of Ireland. I mean, I've seen, obviously, huge changes in Ireland, both north and south. In the south of Ireland, it has gone ahead in terms of liberalisation. When I was growing up, it was the opposite way around. The Republic of Ireland was much more conservative. Now it would have gone ahead. Northern Ireland is slowly getting more liberal in terms of things like, you know, marriage equality, reproductive rights, whatever else. But it is that bit slower. Where I think if there was to be constitutional change, and whether it has, you know, whether it has to be a unitary governance. I mean, I would argue that Dublin is too powerful anyway, you know, and really what we should be doing, looking at over the next 10 to 15 years before any referenda, is a range of options. You know, you might be talking about some sort of, you know, confederal system. I mean, you're talking about two entities that have 100 years of difference. You know, and we've been looking at the difficulties and opportunities as well, but the difficulties of German reunification. You know, just putting people together very quickly without doing the initial work, I think can be fairly disastrous. You know, you might be talking about reprofiling the Seanad, the second chamber in the Republic of Ireland, if it was a confederal situation, to ensure a certain proportion of seats for people with a British identity. That sort of thing. And actually, I would argue, I mean, I would like to see some form of a unitary state, because I think it makes sense. But I'm open in terms of the format that would take. And I do think, actually, a lot of work needs done in the Republic of Ireland, where there has been a degree of sitting back saying, well, first of all, you know, there was exhilaration over the Good Friday Agreement. Then they sort of lost interest, they got bored. Then they had the 2008 economic recession, so they ignored us. And now they're sort of, the interest is creeping back a bit. But it's still, you know, varies who you're talking to in terms of where the interest is. So I think if there was a lot more planning in terms of a new society, rather than just assuming that Northern Ireland has a referendum, 50% plus one, and then is stuck on to what's there. And we have the potential to have that sort of negotiation. The real challenge is, how do you bring the unionist population in Northern Ireland into that conversation? Because they sort of feel if they even start engaging in that conversation, they're selling the pass. You know, they're almost saying, oh, well, this will happen. So it is looking at, you know, well, you know, how do we have that inclusive conversation? And particularly, how do young people have that inclusive conversation? Because they're the ones that really probably are more fixated on social and economic issues rather than just perhaps the older constitutional issues.
Sorry, can I actually add to that? Is this on? Yeah. Sorry, I just stand up. You were talking there, sorry, forward. You were talking there a bit about the, you know, what next? And I think you're quite right. We took our eye off the ball a little in the South. We went, great, we've got an agreement. Right, that's done and dusted. Let's look on to the next thing. But one of the things that interests me as a former student of politics, actually at the time the Good Friday Agreement was signed, so I was sitting where you are now, 25 years ago. That doesn't make me feel old at all. One of the things that interests me is we have a method in Ireland of constitutional conventions and citizens' assemblies to talk about difficult issues. We had one on abortion, we've just had one on biodiversity, there's one going on drugs. So we bring together experts and also members of the public to talk through issues which have a societal impact and to put forward recommendations to government to then legislate on the issues. And one of the developments in the past couple of years has been Right, okay. Brexit has precipitated the conversation about the potential for a united Ireland, the potential for a vote. What does this mean for us? What would a future Ireland look like? And so they've set up a shared island division in the office of the Prime Minister to look at these issues. And it has started its deliberations not around the political side, which is quite interesting. It said, well, we had the Good Friday Agreement. We have some cooperation in our healthcare system. That's one strand to look at. We have, obviously, cross-border initiatives. We have farms, which are in both jurisdictions. There is a lot already going on. Let's park that issue of the vote goes one way or another way. We are on a shared island. We have a certain level of integration. How do we put forward the fact that it already exists? And then what process do we need to put in place to have that dialogue with all communities so that any future integration is not as scary as it might be? So it's happening. Like all these things, it takes time. Hopefully, it will be as inclusive as it should be, and hopefully it'll take your 3 principles. I think that that wouldn't be a bad place to start.
Just a small remark, because I'm very much interested also in Wales. I work a lot on Wales. And I think that your concluding remarks are really interesting to indicate that maybe it's necessary to widen the perspective, and that any future of Northern Ireland is, of course, linked to the Republic, but I think it's also linked to Wales and Scotland about their own futures. And I think that they should be invited as well to discussions, because of course what goes on in Ireland is also going to impact them. So I think it's really a necessary reflection and discussion about the whole future, not just of the UK, but of all the British Isles, I think.
This will be the last question.
I wanted to ask you, you said that the Good Friday Agreement was inspired by South African agreement, if I'm not wrong. Do you think the Good Friday Agreement can inspire agreement in other conflictual regions similar to Northern Ireland?
I think there's aspects of it that can. I think, for example, that recognition of the ability not just to have, one political aspiration or one identity, but a multifaceted sort of identity is useful in terms of other contested regions. I think actually that the mechanism whereby people were elected to actually negotiate the Good Friday Agreement is also useful for other contested areas because it was very deliberately looking to include all those that were party to the conflict. And that actually was a change from the situation with the Sunningdale Agreement back in 1973 that was mentioned, where it was very much the sort of centrist parties that were brought in. The system that was set up in 1996 was actually deliberately to bring in the smaller parties. I think there are aspects of international relations that has changed for the worst. During the 1990s, there was much more of a sense of moving towards saying, no, we have to be inclusive, as indeed Colombia did. But then you had 9/11, so you had the sort of the international narrative narrowing, and you had Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka got away with a winner-takes-all approach and excluding other people. And that still, I think, is with us today, and you can see it today, which actually would go against the sort of the understanding of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, I think the other thing that the Good Friday Agreement did come to grips with, which again probably would be more difficult in some cases today, is that whole discussion around reprofiling security, the state, release of political prisoners and so forth. Though it was controversial with us, but I mean, we did push forward with it. And I think the other thing was more a process issue. And that was the sense that, you know, to actually get some sort of a governance which would reflect the differences in society, that power sharing was important. Now, it has been a bit of a nightmare in terms of actually implementing governance, but that it was also important, and bringing in those smaller parties. And I always remember George Mitchell saying, why do we need all these smaller parties? You know, we've only got 2 major parties in America, the Democrats and Republicans, and you're just making it more complex. He had a point, but actually we needed to do it. So that's something, again, for other regions, you know, not ignoring some of the smaller parties. But I think it is somewhat more difficult today in terms of the current international relations narrative than it probably was with us.
Thank you so much for that. And just if you were wondering why she was looking over at me every time she talked about Colombia, my last job was in Colombia, working on the peace process there. And that was, I think, the first time our paths crossed. I think that's it for today. I would just like to thank you for your attention. I hope it's been interesting for you. I wish you luck in your module on the Troubles, and don't hesitate to stay in touch with the consulate. So thank you so much, both of you, for organizing this, and